The BBC has just published its annual report. That document outlines the organisation's performance over the previous 12 months, its ambitions for the future, and the earnings of top BBC talent. More on that in a moment. But it's also revealed that 500,000 households have opted to cancel, yes, cancel, their licence fee. The Guardian reports this. The total number of British households paying the £169.50 licence fee fell to 23.9 million, suggesting a growing number of people feel able to go without BBC services. The fall has hit the BBC's income at a time when its finances were already struggling, owing to a decade of funding cuts and high inflation. That is particularly bad news for the BBC, who are trying to cope with those funding cuts of around 30% over the last decade. And then there's the fact that the BBC is proving less popular with younger audiences, who are turning towards more modern streaming services such as Netflix and, yes, YouTube. Only 69% of Britons aged under 16 said they consumed any BBC content in an average week. If that sounds like a lot, and of course comparatively it is, that figure rises to 96% among those older than 55. So we're seeing a major divergence in consumption of the BBC by age. That's not a new story, of course, but there has been massive, prolonged investment to attract younger audiences, and it doesn't really seem to be working. And on current affairs, things are particularly grim. 46% of UK adults watch BBC TV News and current affairs on a weekly basis over the last 12 months, a fall of 4% on the year before. And perhaps this is why. Just 45% of Brits view the BBC as impartial when it comes to news and current affairs, a fall of 5% on the year before. Think about this for a moment. 45%. There is no longer a majority in this country which thinks the BBC is impartial. It's still a plurality view. If you have to have all the groups of people with views on this stuff, the largest group thinks the BBC is impartial, but it's not the majority one. It's not 50% plus one. When you think about that, it's kind of crazy that people still have to pay £169.50 if they want to watch live TV. There's no majority for people who think it's impartial, but they have to pay all that money anyway. 57% of respondents think the BBC is effective at providing news. That's a fall of 4% on the year before, which again is a huge shift. It's not a majority. It's still, it's not a plurality rather, it's still a majority. A majority still thinks that the BBC is impartial, but it's a big fall. The number of people who think the BBC is effective at providing news is heading in a similar direction. It's going down quite quickly. And by the way, 15 years ago, these were very fringe views. I know, because I was one of the people on the fringe. And it doesn't help the BBC that some of the corporation, so widely accused of bias, are among those receiving the biggest pay rises. Nick Robinson, host of the Today podcast, earned £349,000 last year. Wow. That was an increase, by the way, of £70,000. His pay rise, 70000. He now earns more than twice the Prime Minister. Incredible. Meanwhile, Laura Kuenssberg got a 20 grand pay rise to £330,000 for hosting her rather, I think, underwhelming Sunday politics show and various appearances on newscasts. I don't watch it. Maybe it's good. I would have no idea. I've never seen it. The argument is obviously made repeatedly that if you don't pay these kinds of figures, you won't get the talent. These people will just leave, as if there isn't a wealth of talent that could fill these positions several dozen times over. My favorite example with regards to this is Stephen Nolan. He hosts shows for BBC Radio 5 Live and BBC Northern Ireland. He earns a paltry £410,000 for doing so. Does anyone seriously think there is a media outlet in Northern Ireland that could match that? You know, what does the editor of the Belfast Telegraph earn? A quarter of that? I don't think so. Try a fifth, maybe a sixth. It's no surprise there's falling trust in the BBC's ability to be impartial when you have people earning hundreds of thousands of pounds a year, and in the case of Robinson, receiving a £70,000 pay rise while asking whether junior doctors should go on strike. Is it? Are you surprised? I'm not surprised. I roll my eyes, in fact.